And good morning. Welcome to Heal DC. This is Joni Eisenberg with Chuck Hicks. Good morning, Chuck.
Morning, Joni.
And we have an important and exciting hour in store for you today. We're going to be focusing for the hour on Cuba. Cuba C, honoring the Cuban Revolution. We have three magnificent guests, at least two of whom don't need much of an introduction. We are thankful and blessed to be joined for the hour by Andy Shalal, who to probably almost everyone listening needs no introduction, but we will introduce him to say that he is the founder of the wonderful Busboys and Poets, now in, I believe, 9 locations throughout the DC area, including Be More, a wonderful place where you can not only eat, but you can look at books, and the community gathers for special events. Andy, of course, has been part of the WPFW community, used to be heard on these airwaves, is an Iraqi-American, a peace activist, and has just returned from Cuba. So he will be sharing lots of thoughts and activities resulting from that trip. We are also joined by the wonderful person who also needs no real introduction, James Early, our frequent guest on this show and on other shows here on WPFW. James worked for over 31 years at the Smithsonian Institute, is a folklore expert and scholar and an activist, and we're very, very thankful that James will also be joining us for the hour. And then our third guest will be talking about a very important health campaign. Bob Schwartz is the executive director of the Global Health Partners and has a very critical campaign called the Saving Lives Campaign, which is focusing on bringing important life-saving medical equipment to Cuba. And we'll be hearing from Bob a little later in the hour. I also want to personally dedicate this show to my friend Jimmy Furlow, a longtime activist in Pittsburgh who often supported this show, recently passed in May, but was very dedicated and active in bringing people to Pittsburgh, to Cuba from Pittsburgh, and supporting in critical campaigns in Cuba. With that said, we're going to start by asking each guest to just give us a 1 or 2 minute, a quick introduction about your involvement with Cuba and what you hope to share today. And after that quick intro, we will give each person at least 10 minutes or so to share. So, Andy, let's start with you.
First of all, thank you so much, Joni, for hosting the show, because I think it's an important conversation to have about Cuba. There's a lot of misinformation around Cuba. And of course, for a moment there, we had opening of relations with Cuba at some level when President Obama was in charge. And unfortunately, all that was reversed once Trump got in, and we're waiting to see where Biden stands on things. Things are loosening up a little bit, but certainly not as fast or as well as they could. My involvement with Cuba actually was enhanced by my relationship to Langston Hughes. The fact that Busboys and Poets is named after the great poet Langston Hughes, who lived here in Washington in the early 1920s. He worked as a busboy while writing poetry, and once he was working at the Wardman Park Hotel as a busboy. A very famous poet by the name of Vacha Lindsay in 1924 happened to be at the hotel for some conference around poetry and writing. The young Langston Hughes, then, who was 22 years old, slipped some of his poetry next to Vacha Lindsay's plate, whereas Vacha Lindsay looked at the poetry and approved of it with a nod. And later, the next day, when Langston Hughes went on his way to work, picked up the newspaper and read that that there's a busboy poet that has been discovered by Bacha Lindsay. And of course, Langston Hughes knew that was him. He arrives at the hotel to meet a whole bunch of photographers and paparazzi who were interested in talking to him about his poetry and what he's doing. And of course, he went on to be one of the most storied and famous and most prolific poets of the 20th century, and probably the best known poet in America today, even. So Langston Hughes's relationship to Cuba is what really got me motivated to do this trip and go there this past month. And the trip was centered around a very famous poet in Cuba, the national poet of Cuba, Nicolas Guillen. Nicolas Guillen and Langston Hughes had a collaborative relationship back in the early 1930s. Langston Hughes went to Cuba 3 times, 1927, 1930, 1931, met with Nicolas Guillen, and both of them collaborated on some work, including some translations of Nicolas Guillen's work from Spanish to English. He really, Langston Hughes' career was moving up at that point, and he really helped to enhance Nicolas Guillen's career and guide him toward thinking about how he can mix his poetry with the kind of the local culture, the African culture of Cuba, and so developed something called the Sun, which was obviously part of it's like the blues to the United States, and kind of rhythmically set his poems into a sun motif, and they had a collaborative relationship after that. Even they both went to Spain to fight in the Spanish Civil War. So there was a lot of big relationship there. And of course, it's interesting because, Ernest Hemingway is very well known in Cuba. He lived there. He was very much part of the culture. People know who Ernest Hemingway is. Of course, for a good reason. He was just in love with Cuba. He wrote The Old Man of the Sea when he was in Cuba. But the Langston Hughes had never been really recognized in Cuba. And I wanted to see if that could happen. And so the Cuban Ministry of Culture agreed to help to commemorate Langston Hughes' visit to Cuba and his relationship to Nicolas Guillen. So we went there as a delegation to commemorate that very important time. We went there during Nicolas Guillen's birthday, 120th birthday, which happened on July the 10th. We were there. And we were at the Center for Writers, the Union for Writers and Artists, which is in the middle of Havana. And we put a plaque of Langston Hughes and Nicolas Guillen together in the office of Nicolas Guillen, the office that he held as the first president of the Union of Writers and Artists in Cuba back in the early 1960s. And so it was an important moment. And I think everyone really appreciated it. And I think it's one way for us to understand the important interlink between Cuba and the United States that goes way, way back from the turn of the last century. So I think it was a beautiful moment. We plan to go back again in February, as you mentioned earlier, Joni, about going back to February to try to put a statue of Langston Hughes in the center of Havana next to a statue of Nicolas Guillen that exists already there. So I know I talked a lot, but this is the reason why we were there.
Yes, very, very exciting. And I would encourage listeners, those of you who have access to Facebook, you can go on to Andy's Facebook page. And among many other gifts and talents, Andy is quite a fabulous writer. And he takes you on the journey day by day of his trip to Cuba. It's really quite inspiring and quite riveting. It talks about that day that Langston Hughes was honored together with Nicolas Guillen. Very, very exciting. And the trip was starting at what day? It was in early July through recently you just got back.
Yes, it was a 7-day trip. We went early July. We got back sometime last week.
Yes.
Or the week before that, actually. Sorry.
Yes, and one of the things you mentioned in your Facebook page, and some of us are aware that, of course, Cuba puts a big emphasis on culture. There's a minister of culture, and I think you even mentioned there's a minister of hip hop.
Yeah, I mean, there's a department under the Ministry of Culture that focuses on different genres of culture, including hip hop is one of them.
Okay, and that's a great way to segue into James Early. James has a long history with Cuba, but welcome, James.
I'm pleased to be here.
So glad you could be here. And I believe that you've been to Cuba over 50 times. Is that correct?
Yeah, I'm sure it's well over 50. I haven't really followed the number, but I've been consistently going since about 1972 when I first went for the first international conference on the independence of Puerto Rico, and subsequently went as a representative of the Smithsonian Institution in my capacity as deputy and as assistant secretary for education and public service, and later in my work as Director of Cultural Heritage Policy at the Smithsonian Center for Folklife and Cultural Heritage. And the Smithsonian has had a long-standing relationship with Cuban cultural and intellectual and artistic institutions, and always continued to have that relationship that is well documented by the Cubans. And I happened to come into the Smithsonian in 1984 full-time at a point in which the Assistant Secretary for Science at that time was making a trip to Cuba. Ellen Ripley had gone many years earlier, and I was able to add the cultural portfolio to that, which resulted in my colleagues and I being engaged with any number of key Cuban artists and intellectuals, including the late Eusebio Leal, who is the world-renowned architect of the old city of Havana, who died a few years ago. A bronze statue has just been put up in Cuba very recently. Him, Nancy Morillon, the great Afro-Cuban poet who was very close to the Black Arts Movement, poets Jane Cortez and a number of other poets of that era. The last major protege of Nicolas Guillen, and who engaged with Andy and his delegation when they were there. Los Papines, Afro-Cuba, the Matanzas, so forth and so on. Including bringing the great Manuel Mendive to the United States with Alicia Adams, the Vice President for International Programs at the Kennedy Center in the second Clinton administration. I'm just thinking back, and I was 12 years old when the Cuban Revolution occurred, so I had really no knowledge of that. But this is the way that history extends and grasps us as we move along, so that by the time I turned 20, I think we must remember that in 57, the anti-colonial movement, Kwame Nkrumah comes to power in Ghana. And then in 1959, the Cuban Revolution comes. And by that time, you know, my political consciousness, like those in my generation, I'm now 75, almost 76, began to think a lot about what is the significance of Cuba in our lives. And of course, there is a great history, and we'll hear more about what has resulted from the Cuban administration. So I just want to close by, you know, giving just one quote from Fidel Castro as we're celebrating, commemorating the 69 years since the attempt to take over Cuba, the government of Cuba, for the people of Cuba, which failed in its first instance. Fidel Castro was imprisoned, and after 2 years, because of a major amnesty campaign was set out, people don't realize that he came to the United States and actually raised money among Cuban communities here in the United States before going off and to go back and to start the revolution with 126, 130 or so people, half of whom were more or less immediately killed. So it's an extraordinary story, but here's the quote. You know, Fidel Castro said that when we speak of the people, we are not referring to the wealthy, but the unemployed, farm workers, industrial workers, small farmers, and other toilers, those who know misfortune and are therefore capable of fighting with limitless courage. To the people, the revolutionary movement is not going to say, we will give you everything, but rather, Here it is. Now fight for it with everything you have. And indeed, they have since 1959 fought for their revolution with everything that they have. It was not started out as a socialist revolution. It was a nationalist revolution grounded in the sovereignty, respectful sovereignty and independence perspectives of people like Céspedes, who led the Revolutionary War against Spain and liberating enslaved Africans that he owned, who really made the difference in the defeat of Spain, and Jose Marti, the nationalists. And today, Cuba carries that line of wanting to have respectful, mutual, beneficial relations with all peoples and countries around the world. And within the established protocols of the United Nations being the key of how nations debate their differences, to do those respectfully and peacefully. What has redounded to the world community and why we should be commemorating the revolution. You'll hear more from Bob Swartz in a minute about the extraordinary health care that Cuba has developed internally and has shared with the rest of the world, including the rest of the developed world. And it was just this July 30th, yesterday, 2 days ago, that Cuba announced that it had come up, I think, with a 6th vaccine against the variant. Now, at the same time, the Cubans are suffering blackouts, food shortages because of the U.S. embargo. And I use that term embargo because it's a legal congressional construct that must be deconstructed in legal means within the United States Congress. Cubans use the term blockade as a useful term, particularly from their perspective. But from the work that we as citizens need to do and the continuing uplift of the contribution of the Cuban Revolution to all humanity is to move on U.S. Congress and this Biden-Harris administration to allow food sales to Cuba, to stop the economic warfare and attempt at regime change against Cuba, and to reinstitute the negotiations towards full diplomatic relations that not that President Obama gave to Cuba, but President Obama and then President Raul Castro negotiated respectfully to establish new diplomatic relations. And that is where we as citizens should not only just learn about Cuba, but take our responsibility in engaging with the Cubans for mutual benefit for people around the world, particularly in the arena of healthcare. And I'll stop there as why we should be commemorating July 26, 1953, which kicked off the Cuban Revolution that we know today.
That was exactly what I was going to ask you, James. So, James, we're getting ready now to meet someone who has not been on our airwaves yet, but this won't be the first time he'll be joining us. Bob Swartz, who is the executive director of Global Health Partners. And James, perhaps you could just help me introduce him before he jumps on with us.
Well, let us let Bob introduce himself, because things that he is involved in has been involved at the very practical level of engagement with people-to-people relations and the mutual beneficial relations that we might have. So with that, let's ask Bob.
Yes, welcome, Bob.
Well, thanks, Joni. Thanks for inviting me this morning. Just by way of background for your listeners, I'm the executive director of Global Health Partners. It's a 40-year-old organization, nonprofit based in New York, that's been providing solidarity and medical assistance to Cuba since, 1994. We've donated more than $240 million worth of meds and medical supplies to Cuba. I took Muhammad Ali to Cuba twice. I took 2 former U.S. Surgeons General to Cuba. And we've brought 38 surgical teams from across the United States to Cuba. So James said, we're pretty much on the ground on a regular basis to pick up on some of the achievements and the hardships that are going on right now that James had discussed. Cuba it's a very difficult moment, and I think Andy experienced that over the last month. The embargo has a devastating impact on Cuba, and nowhere is that felt more than in the public health sector. The embargo kills just as surely as bullets and bombs, and we have been punishing millions of Cubans for more than 60 years. Some of your listeners may recall last year I headed up the syringe campaign. And let me just touch on that because it really speaks to the impact of the embargo. The impact of the embargo affects every aspect of Cuban life, as James pointed out: the high cost of food, the lack of material and equipment to construct new housing, shortages in the public transportation sector, energy shortages, which they're experiencing blackouts again right now. But I'm convinced that the public health sector probably suffers the most. Last year, Cuba had a very unique problem, which again speaks to how Cuba is forced to live and function under the embargo. Cuba made a decision early on in the pandemic to develop and produce their own vaccines. They didn't trust the COVAX program to deliver sufficient vaccine. And they were also concerned that the United States would interfere with vaccine delivery. So if you can imagine this, Joni, in the middle of a pandemic that devastated their economy, Cuba went to work and developed 2 vaccines that have the same efficacy as Pfizer and Moderna. Both of those shots the vaccines require 3 shots, which meant they needed 30 million syringes to fully vaccinate the population. Global Health Partners was asked to step up together with dozens of local and national organizations. And we launched a campaign in the United States to provide Cuba with the syringes they needed to combat COVID. And we ultimately shipped more than 6 million syringes, if you can imagine that, 6 million syringes to Cuba. So our success with that campaign saved lives. It helped to vaccinate Cuba's entire population, and it helped to reopen the country. So here we are now 2 years plus into the pandemic. Essential medicines, including antibiotics, analgesics, asthma inhalers, insulin, are almost non-existent in Cuba due to the pandemic and the blockade, which makes it very difficult for Cuba to buy it from U.S. manufacturers, and it prohibits them from accessing foreign credit markets. The campaign we've launched this spring, and which continues this summer, builds on the syringe campaign. And it, if you can imagine, their leading trauma hospital in Havana has 23 operating rooms, but only 2 working anesthesia machines. So the campaign we've launched is to provide anesthesia machines, suture, and life-saving surgical equipment. So that's in a nutshell what we're trying to do. It's a Band-Aid. It's not an answer to the type of normalization of relations that James is talking about, but it will save lives. It will help Cuba get through this rough patch. I was fascinated with Tony's diary of his Busboys and Poets trip to Cuba recently, and I think it's an important read because it discusses both the achievements of the Cuban Revolution, and it also discusses a lot of the hardships that Cuba is going through right now. And the reality is, it doesn't have to be that way. So I'm hoping that PFW listeners are going to step up during this campaign and lend a hand and help us to purchase this equipment. I think I'll stop there, Joni.
Yeah, and we'll make sure to share in a moment how listeners can do that. But Bob, just give us a real life example. I think you were able to send a number of the medical equipment, the anesthesia equipment that saved a couple of lives. Can you just share that story so that it's real for people that this is what you're doing is saving lives?
Well, we have not shipped the anesthesia machines yet. The anesthesia machines will go later this month and into September. But let me give you, over the last 3 decades, let me give you a couple of vignettes that really stand out in my mind. I've sat in Cuban pediatric hospitals with parents watching as their kids struggle with cancer. And they know the medicines to save their lives are only 90 miles away. And because of the embargo, they're unable to purchase those medicines. And sadly, many of their kids die. I've been to the Cuban National Oncology Hospital, and I've sat with women that are diagnosed with breast cancer, and it's detected at a late stage because Cuba doesn't have the radiology equipment, the imaging equipment to diagnose it earlier. And these are mothers, these are wives, these are workers, their grandmothers, and it's painful to me. You know, I've got 3 very healthy grandkids, and I look at everything that they've got, and you look at what's going on in Cuba today, and it doesn't have to be that way. When Cuba is trying to buy radio imaging equipment, they can't buy it from the United States manufacturers. So that's a couple of vignettes that I'd rather share with you.
Yes. Thank you. Again, we are talking to Bob Schwartz, who's the Executive Director of Global Health Partners. We're spending the hour focusing on Cuba with James Early and Andy Shalal, who we'll get back to in a moment. But I just wanted to say this year, To Heal DC is honoring our 30 years on the air. And throughout these 30 years, we have always, not lately too much, but we have done many, many shows on Cuba and Cuba's healthcare system. As James mentioned, Cuba really has as an exemplary system that really is in many ways far above our system. As many of you know, the United States has one of the lowest life expectancy rates in the world with the industrialized nations. Cuba has a lot that we could learn from if we chose to, including making sure that people are educated on a neighborhood basis of their healthcare needs. If they have a problem or question, there are people that go door to door to assist them. So, and I must say, Bob, I understand what you're saying about breast cancer, et cetera, but the horror stories that I hear every day about people unable to get basic healthcare system services in the richest country and in the capital of this nation. That's the reason why we started this show. So it's refreshing what you're doing, but we always have to keep in mind that this healthcare system we have is based on profits and not on people's needs. So with that said, we're going to go to a very short music break recommended by James Early, and I'll ask James to comment on it once we hear it. So let's hear that piece, Magic Mike. Mm-hmm. You're listening to WPFW 89.3 FM. This is To Heal DC with me, Joni, and Chuck. And we're focusing on Cuba today. And James, Early, you want to share with our listeners what was that piece we just heard?
That piece is entitled Cuba Linda, Beautiful Cuba by the late Virgilio Martí. It was recorded by Grupo Folclórico Experimental Novoyorquino, which is a group out of New York City formed by the renowned René Lopez, Puerto Rican, who's now 81, 82 years of age, and which great musicians who still reside in the United States after multiple generations, particularly Afro-Cubans, who go back and forth, who relate to the island. This was the era of the great Patato Valdez, the late great Conguero, Chocolate Amenteros, the great Afro-Cuban trumpeter, Julito Collazo, the great Batat, drummer and religious figure. And that connection between Cubans in the United States, and particularly Cubans who came in the early part of the century up through the 1950s or so, who moved into Black Cuban musicians, who moved into African-American neighborhoods, grew up around African-American music, and African-Americans growing up around Cuban music. This is one of the strongest people-to-people relations. And today in New York City, you've got an extraordinary group of Cuban jazz musicians of all ethnic racial backgrounds from Cuba who have come over the last 20 years, who are really a great example of the relationship between our two peoples and what the relationship between our two governments could be. So that's the context of that piece. A beautiful Cuba. It is still in all of its misery imposed by the embargo, the lack of being able to get food sales, the lack of vaccines. I've been in kidney hospitals with Danny Glover, in which we see people, patients using the same machine, modulating according to needs because they cannot get enough kidney machines in. And we have to realize that in all of this misery, Cuba still dedicates the Cuban government in working with its citizens. This is an elected constitutional government, whether someone here likes that constitution or the way that they do their democratic process, still provides basic health care and education as much as they possibly can, not only for their citizens, but for the rest of the world, even as they experience the miseries imposed by the United States government. And Joni, let me just stop on this point. So what do we do with this information? We are in an electoral season 2022, moving towards 2024. We have got to elect politicians who will respond to the aspirations of the U.S. public, including Cuban Americans, the great majority of whom say down with this embargo, allow food sales, allow us to travel freely. What is it that they're so afraid of that we will see in Cuba that they will not allow U.S. citizens to travel? So contact Congressman Meeks, head of the Foreign Relations Commission, who has somewhat of a fracture line with the Biden-Harris administration on Cuba policy. As Pelosi goes off to organize against China rather than being in our own hemisphere to deal with what we, the citizens, are saying. We want relationships with Cuba, respectful, mutual, beneficial relationships with Cuba. Contact ACERE, ACERE, which is a new progressive policy organization, and you can go online. That's ACERE. It's a coalition of organizations and individuals that believe that sanctions and economic blockades are not the right answer to resolve conflicts and political and ideological conflicts between countries. So we have a responsibility as citizens to do something. And I said finally, but this is finally, I do hope that Andy Shalal may be planning to organize public travel opportunity for people who want to go to Cuba. It's legal to go to Cuba. And Andy, if that's going to be the case, I hope you are ready to tell people when they should start to contact, what services might be provided for them to participate in February 2023 in celebration of the great Langston Hughes, another extraordinary example of U.S. people-to-people relationships that he established with the Cuban revolutionary poet, Nicolas Guillen.
Yes, Andy, and this is such an exciting opportunity. It's important for people who have not yet been to Cuba, and especially PFW listeners, to start to think about joining Andy on this trip. And of course, we'll be talking about it more than once. But Andy, share with the listeners what you are at least beginning to think about for February 2023.
Yes. First of all, I want to say a very special thank you to Bob. I think the work that he does is really extraordinary in so many ways. And I am originally from Iraq, and my wife is originally from Iran. So we know what embargoes can do. It's not just, I think for a lot of Americans, they think of an embargo, oh, well, we're going to limit some, arms sales or something like that. But this is more serious than that. This is limiting, as James said, even food purchases without cash. The Cubans have to pay cash up front before they can get any food into their markets. The amount of deprivation that this kind of embargo causes is really underestimated by most Americans. We are kind of blind to it in so many ways. We think it's harmless, but it's really harming a lot of people. As people remember, back when Iraq was under an embargo, somebody asked Madeleine Albright back then, a very famous thing. They said, 5,000 children were dying every single month due to the embargo. And she said, that doesn't concern me. That's pretty devastating. And I think we have to pull the veil off of that and really start being concerned, because that was something that came back to haunt her over and over again. And we don't want to have that kind of situation happen in Cuba. Cuba is a country of 11 million people. They have nothing that they can do to the United States that the United States is afraid of. The Trump administration put Cuba on the list of states that sponsor terrorism. If anyone has been sponsoring terrorism against a country, is our country against Cuba. We've attacked it. We've tried to poison their leaders. We have, sent spies in there. We've done all kinds of things to try to undo the revolution of Cuba. And I'm not here to talk about politics. I'm not here to condone or condemn. I'm just talking about the idea of leaving a country alone and allowing it to fulfill its own destiny, as opposed to us insisting on making Cuba the playground for the United States. It was made the playground for the mafia for a long time. It became our sugar factory for a long time. It was a lot of abuse that has happened. Of course, Guantanamo historically was part of that whole deal that was made back after the Spanish-American War. But anyway, there's a lot to be concerned here. And I think Americans really need to not put Cuba on the back burner, because really what happens in Cuba is an example of our values as Americans and how we can actually uphold those values. It is laughable. Our policy with Cuba is laughable at this point. For us to put Cuba on such a list and then go the next day and do a fist bump with Yair Lapid and with MBS in Saudi Arabia and Israel, it seems really odd. And I think, as much as our politicians would like to think that most people are stupid about this stuff, people recognize when something looks really horrible and shady to the way we deal with Cuba. But back to the culture and the trip, we are planning on going back in February. So as I mentioned earlier, we were there during Nicolas Guillen's birthday celebration, 120th in July, and we will see the 121st birthday of Langston Hughes in February. So in February, we're going to be going there, and we want to be able to take people there, and it will coincide with the Cuban Book Festival, or the Havana Book Festival, which is considered one of the largest book festivals in the world. I have not been to it, but I understand it's quite remarkable, and it's something that we want to be able to do. And we plan to bring some authors there. I'm trying to speak with the DC government to see if we can get a go-go band to actually go there, introduce go-go to Havana. I think it'll be really a big hit. Imagine what kind of relationship we can create just through music and through art and through culture. That's the reason why I opened Busboys and Poets to begin with. It was about really connections of art and culture with people that otherwise wouldn't be able to connect with one another on a different level. Art and culture is the connective tissue for our humanity, and we need to really do more and more of that. And that's my role.
And of course, Andy, this trip would be a perfect example, or in Cuba is a perfect example of Jazz and Justice, which is what PFW is all about. We hope that in the coming weeks and months, we can talk about perhaps how PFW can collaborate with you on this trip. Very, very exciting trip. It's so important for people to actually go to Cuba yourselves and see it. I know I had the blessing of going many moons ago, and it's life-changing. It's extremely inspiring, and it's something that many of our listeners should really try to do. So this February is a great moment
it's also important to know that there's a lot of work being done behind the scenes that we don't know about. That hopefully we'll try to right this wrong. Like there are delegations that are going from the United States. There are Congress people that are going. I know that Barbara Lee is leading a congressional delegation. They're going to be going during this month to try to really talk about how we can undo some of the damage that has occurred. And I think a lot of the conversation, it's important to bring it up. Maybe this is a good moment about the uprising they had in July 11th. This is of last year, where there were arrests that were made of artists. And I think people have been asking about that, saying, like, what happened? Why are you arresting artists? That was a question that we asked over and over again when we were meeting with officials there. And, the answers are what you would expect answers to be in that situation. These are people that broke the law and we arrested them. Of course, want to be able to have a little bit more transparency as Americans. But as much as I like to think it's our business to tell Cuba how to conduct its affairs, it's important for us to talk about it. It's important for us to open it up. It's important for us to have that conversation. But that should not be a thing that gets in the way of us opening relations, because the only way you can undo, the stronghold that Cuba feels like it has to have, because it's still in a state of a revolution, is by opening up to travel for people to go about. It happened in Iran, happened in Iraq. The more you squeeze, the harder it is for the government to be able to function. And therefore, you start, becoming a lot more conservative in the way you approach things. So I think it's important for us to also say that in order for us to begin to have this conversation about the artists and the arrests and all that, we have to undo some of the damage that we've already created in Cuba and start building that trust. And culture is a starting point.
Joni, can I up on
Sure.
that point that Andy has just raised, because it's very, very important. Those street demonstrations in Cuba really captured the attention of a lot of people in the United States and around the world. And I would urge people to do this. And this is where each of us, no matter what our ideological or political background is, if we are earnest about respectful relations, debate, and justice compromise, as I would put it, go online and read what Cubans are saying, not just what the Cuban government is saying, but what artists and intellectuals and everyday citizens across the island are saying. But also about that particular incident, but also read what the President Diaz-Canel said. He said there are objective reasons why people are frustrated and off not being able to get certain kind of access. And he said the objective reasons the Cuban officials must take responsibility for dealing with. But what they will not support is people who are trying to overthrow the country. So when we talk about the protests of artists and intellectuals in Cuba, there are two broad divisions. One is patriotic, critical to hold their government accountable to their needs and aspirations and their democratic access to express themselves. The other is tied into the U.S. State Department, which is very well documented, particularly around cultural expressions like hip hop, and where the United States government has been organizing for regime change. You don't have to be able to read in Spanish to find this. You can go online and find a lot of English commentary. This is where we have to activate our responsible citizenship to know for ourselves and to be informed of what we want to hold our government accountable. The last thing I would say about that is that over the last 10, 12 years, particularly with when Raul Castro was president of Cuba and Diaz-Canel, the present president, was for that 10-year period or so his main assistant, there has been a lot of internal open discussion about democracy and socialism, meaning what is the pivotal role of the citizen in relationship to the public servant. And Raul Castro was very clear with the Communist Party of Cuba that while it was indispensable to the direction and the security of the country, that it is not the government and it is not the citizen, and that they must listen to the criticisms that citizens are raising, and they must resolve problems. The last thing I would say on that is when Raul Castro was approved by the National Assembly as president of the country when his brother stepped down because of health reasons, Fidel Castro, he said, this embargo is killing us. But if it were removed tomorrow, this revolution may not survive because of our own errors and failures. So that Cuba is a very dynamic place, even in the midst of this economic war against them, of taking on these internal questions in which you can only serve now 2 terms as head of the government. Those are democratic and private enterprise is being opened up in the Cuban socialism. So that if the United States would back off and follow the protocols of nations about debate of differences, then I think the Cubans will demonstrate how they can thrive even more. But they are not gods. They have their own contradictions. So I urge people to pressure their government, our government, about going to Cuba and looking for yourselves, not taking our word for it.
Absolutely. And we have 5 minutes left, and we have each guest can give their closing comment. Bob Schwartz, Andy, and James. And of course, one of the things that Chuck and I want to make sure we do, this is not going to be the last time we talk about Cuba. Perhaps we could see if PFW might dedicate a whole day sometime soon to Cuba and really give James and Andy and Bob and the music of Cuba, combine the jazz with the justice. So we hope we can do that in the future. But let me start with Bob Schwartz and the important campaign, Saving Lives campaign. Bob, please tell our listeners how they can donate to your critical campaign and how they can follow your organization, Global Health Partners.
Sure. Well, first, the best way to donate is online. And your listeners can find us at ghpartners.org. That's globalhealthpartners.org. And there's a secure online donation page there. We can assure you that every dollar that's donated will be spent on medical supplies for this campaign. It's targeted for one specific hospital in Havana, the Calixto Garcia Hospital. So you'll be able to see online what we're trying to do. We're trying to raise $137,000. I think we've raised half of that already. But you can keep your eye on that. It's probably a 2-month campaign at most. But also, James had mentioned advocacy, and I think that's critically important. James and I are both on the ASETE Advisory Committee, and I'd suggest that listeners plug into asete.org, become informed about legislation and what they can do to influence Washington. The embargo won't be lifted until Congress moves. So to James's point, it's important to activate listeners as quickly as possible. And third, to Andy's Busboys and Poets trips. I don't normally suggest specific trips, but I noticed Andy's Busboys and Poets trip was very, very fairly priced. It was a very rich program. So I suggest the listeners keep their eyes open on that. Be a worthwhile trip to go on.
And we are going to continue to talk about it. We have, thankfully, a few months between now and February. And again, for people who want to donate for that Saving Lives campaign, that's ghp.org.
GH Partners. GHPARTNERS.org.
Okay, ghpartners.org. Okay, Andy, your final comments. And again, we're hoping that we will be able to hear from you and Bob and James frequently between now and February, and that WPFW could really partner with you in this upcoming trip, as well as partner with Bob and the medical campaign. But Andy, your final words for today.
Absolutely. We are Cuban Culture Day is on October the 20th, and we're planning on doing a lot of programs around that. Music, art, food, of course, mojitos and other things that people are familiar with when it comes to Cuba and Cuban culture. We believe that in order to change hearts and minds, culture is the only way to do it. It doesn't work with PowerPoint presentations or statistics, unfortunately. It works when we are culturally connected to one another. And we already are predisposed to being connected to Cuban culture. A lot of Cuban culture already exists here in the United States, and we just need to highlight it and make sure that it is stays in the forefront of people's minds. I think, as James mentioned, a lot of the stuff that happened around the artists and the rest of artists, was funded by a movement in Cuba called the San Isidro movement, which has been linked to the Miami Cubans, people that want to undo the revolution, undo the government. And again, this is not about condoning or condemning any group, but it's about leaving people to their own resources, let them make those decisions. But Cuba has been in a revolution ever since 1959, and it has not ended. I mean, we've been, attacking Cuba and squeezing Cuba from then. So they're still in the middle of that revolution. And it's important to recognize that when that's the situation, you have to be a little bit more mindful and more careful in how you see your citizens conducting themselves. But we look forward to having people join us on this trip. It will be open to everyone. And as Bob mentioned, it is reasonably priced, and we work very, very, very closely to try to get a full gamut of exposure to Cuban culture, not just going to the fancy places and eating in fancy restaurants. That's not what happens. What happens is we go down into the streets, into the alleys, into the artists' homes, into places that otherwise people may not be able to see. So we look forward to having people join us in that. Please stay tuned and look out for it.
Absolutely. And thank you, Andy Shalal, for everything you do, including planning this wonderful upcoming trip in February to Cuba. Thank you, James Early, for all of your decades of work and your more than 50 trips to Cuba. And of course, thanks to Bob Schwartz, who's doing this excellent work, Saving Lives campaign, grouphealthpartners.org. I want to thank our Magic Mike, our wonderful engineer. Thanks to Crystal, who helps us with these beautiful flyers. Thanks to Mari, who helps us with the Zoom. And thanks to you, Chuck, for hanging in there with us. And again, this will not be the last time we talk about Cuba. It's very important for people to get to know Cuba close and upfront and see how it and experience how it's an example of true jazz and justice. Stay tuned for PFW for the rest of the day. We're going to go out with a song that is close to my heart, sung hopefully by a group of children. Cuba, Que Linda es Cuba, it's sung by children from Cuba, and this is a very popular song in Cuba. Stay well and stay positive and stay with us here on WPFW.
Yo te invito a que busques por el mundo otro cielo tan azul como tu cielo, una luna tan brillante como aquella que se filtra en la dulzura de la caña, un fidel que vibra en la montaña, un rubí 5 franjas y una estrella, un fidel que vibra en la montaña, un rubí 5 franjas y una estrella. Cuba, que linda es Cuba, que la defiende la quiere más. Cuba, que linda es Cuba, que la defiende la quiere más. ¿Quién te defiende, mi Cuba bella? ¿Quién te defiende, te quiere más? Cuba, que linda es Cuba, que la defiende la quiere más. Qué linda es Cuba, Cuba, que linda es Cuba, que la defiende la quiere más. Ahora el Guajiro vive contento, vive feliz, en comunidad. Qué linda es Cuba, Cuba, que linda es Cuba, que la defiende la quiere más. Qué linda es Cuba, Cuba, que linda es Cuba, que la defiende la quiere más. Un fidel que vibra en la montaña, un rubí 5 franjas y una estrella.
Black as you, black as me, black as us, black as free, black as
Hello, I'm Margaret Kimberly, Executive Editor of Black Agenda Report. We're happy to present Black Agenda Radio on WPFW. Black Agenda Report provides news, commentary, and analysis from a Black left perspective. Every week on Black Agenda Radio, we speak to activists, community leaders, scholars, and others who discuss local, national, and international news. WPFW listeners are an important part of the Black Agenda Report community. You'll hear a new Black Agenda Radio segment every week. We look forward to bringing the best of Black Agenda Report to WPFW on Tuesdays at 6 p.m. Thank you.
Hello, I'm Dave Zirin from WPFW's The Collision with an editorial. Brittany Griner, the women's basketball superstar, is currently in prison in Russia, facing 10 years behind bars, 5 years at hard labor for the alleged crime of bringing hashish oil into the country through Moscow airport. It is so important that we realize that Brittany Griner is not facing any form of justice. Instead, she has become a political prisoner, a victim of the growing crisis that exists between Russia and the United States. It is so important that we organize right here and right now to bring Brittany Griner home. Already, there have been protests in places like New York, Phoenix, where Brittany Griner plays, and of course here in Washington, D.C. Not so much to protest Russia to bring Brittany Griner home, but to protest our own government to make sure that they aren't ignoring Brittany Griner and ignoring the plight of her wife, Cheryl. Look, here are the facts. There are two wings of the sports movement right now. One wing loves Brittany Griner so much that they're starting to organize. They're starting to be heard. They're starting to get out there. They're starting to say, we need to organize to bring Brittany Griner home. There's another wing of the sports world that frankly doesn't care. They just don't love Brittany Griner enough. If it was Tom Brady or Steph Curry in a Russian prison facing 10 years behind bars, 5 years at hard labor, believe me, the sports world would stop on its axis, and every day there would be demands to bring Brittany Griner home. Look, the Biden administration quite simply just isn't doing enough. It's vital that we step into the breach and fight to free Brittany Griner. For WPFW, I'm Dave Zirin from The Collision. Have a great day.
Join us at the 15th Annual African Diaspora International Film Festival, August 5th to the 7th, featuring 16 award-winning films. Enjoy Cafe Negro, Cuba and the Haitian Revolution, Dancing the Twist in Bamako, and the fabulous musical Get Out Alive, and meet Kwele TV founder Deshana Spencer. African Diaspora International Film Festival, DC, from August 5th to the 7th, at the George Washington University Student Center, 800 21st Street Northwest. Mask required for entry. Tickets and schedule at nyadiff.org. That's nyadiff.org, or call 212-864-1760. African Diaspora International Film Festival, where Black Life Matters. WPFW, building a better world, one broadcast at a time.
Calling all blues lovers. The WPFW Blues Day fundraiser is coming back, and we're coming back in a big way. Saturday, August 20th is the date, and Lamont's Entertainment Complex is once again the place. The gates will open at noon, and the showtime will run from 1 p.m. till 6 p.m. Performing will be Jim Bennett and the Unique Creation Band with special guests, Hardway Connection Band and Show, Mama Moon and the Rump Shakers, and Clarence the Blues Man Turner. DJ Ultramix will keep the blues pumping in between sets, and Dr. Nick will be the MC. Come meet and greet some of your favorite WPFW blues programmers. The tickets will be $35 per person and may be purchased the day of the show at the gate.